Some runners obsess over pace, distance, and how many gels to eat per hour. Others just want to get out the door and run, but then quickly realize that how you fuel matters just as much as how you move. Today's guest is Mariella Sawyer, a professional triathlete, registered dietitian, and a new mom who understands that performance starts in the kitchen, not just on the trails. From racing around the world to learning how to train through pregnancy and life's chaos, Mariella brings practical, science-backed advice without the overwhelm. In this episode, we bust common myths around caffeine, carbs, hydration, and fasted running, and break down what beginners actually need to know about trail running before, during, and after the run. This one's for anyone who's ever wondered, am I doing this right? Let's dive into it. Mariella, welcome to the Trail Chasers.
Thank you for having me.
What I want to start with is, when you're kind of on a start line of a race, what is that feeling like? Obviously, when you know that you're ready, but then also in terms of Langebaan, when you know that it's not going to be a good day. So what is that kind of feeling like?
I think for me, I always get very nervous before races, especially the bigger ones, when you're up against, some of the best in the world in terms of, the especially like the Ironman races, etc. So it's kind of just about trying to get those butterflies to fly in formation somewhat. And but always, once the gun goes, they tend to do just that. But for me, it's usually just trying to get the nerves under control. Yeah.
So this season is sponsored by Gilnockie Socks, and I'm going to show you a pair of socks that we put together. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but I'm going to ask you at the end of the episode to give me 2 words that you would have on the back of your sock, or your socks. And obviously, bear in mind, it's probably more for the person behind you than it is actually for yourself. But it's going to say a lot about yourself to the person behind you. So what I kind of like to start these interviews with is the kind of poignant moments, in your life, in your career, that kind of led you to this point. And I'm not going to put a number on it, and you can go wherever you want, career, family, whatever you want. So take me through those big moments off the top of your head.
Sure. So I basically started out with always having a passion for sport. And I think I always knew that is something I wanted to get into. And in school, I guess the subjects that I was really interested in was predominantly biology, which then led me to study sports science, which further, kind of sparked the interest in, high performance sport. Not only was I myself interested in doing it, I also was really interested in, the science behind it. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do after studying sports science, but throughout my studies, we, did some modules on sports nutrition. And that's when I was like, sure, okay, this is really interesting. I find this very fascinating. And that's kind of, where my journey kind of started with sports nutrition, where I then went on to go study dietetics. And then the competitive triathlon journey started pretty much alongside that. I kind of entered a half Ironman race, not owning a bike. And then I really enjoyed it, and being somewhat competitive, I decided to kind of go with it and see where it would take me. Yeah.
Sure. Incredible. And if you had sure you do have a business card, but if you have a business card for your kind of life in general, what would it kind of say underneath your name?
In terms of like the dietetic side of things?
Your whole life, if you kind of describe your life in a little phrase underneath your name.
It would probably be something along the lines of keep chipping away, consistency is key, and never underestimate the power of balance. Probably something like that, yeah.
What is the worst nutrition advice, you've ever heard in your career, or that you keep hearing constantly?
I think the one that pushes my buttons the most and comes with the most consequences, I would say, is when athletes get told to, do fasted training. That's definitely one where, my hairs on my back go up a little bit, yeah.
And I know that it's a no-no for women, and men it's a bit more lenient. So are you kind of just let's go no for everyone, or do you kind of men you're a bit more lenient with?
Yes and no. It's a very specific thing to do in terms of training, and it also needs to be implemented correctly. Yeah. And the tricky thing is, or the slippery slope is, the research around it, it's a bit wishy-washy. The theory is obviously that, faster training, we're trying to improve your body's ability to oxidize fat. But it's actually been found that, endurance athletes are generally quite efficient at that anyway. So the question is, how much benefit are we getting from doing those fasted sessions in terms of improving fat oxidation? And also, real life versus scientific research are always very different in terms of looking at, okay, what happens in the research environment where everything's very controlled versus a real life, recreational athlete who's just trying to get their long run in. Faster training affects a variety of things in terms of, how much energy you have during the run, but also mentally it can be quite taxing, just to get through a run without any fuel. So then, add life stress, work stress to that, it can actually cause more damage than good. And, even if you get those few extra percents in terms of fat oxidation efficiency, is that really worth, the grumpiness that might come with it? And then also often it gets done, incorrectly in terms of, then going on to train at the incorrect intensity because you want to be training at a low intensity with faster training. And also, once you're done with the session, you really need to be intentional about refueling properly. And often, in a time-starved athlete, that then gets neglected. And then you're really looking into, a bit of a snowball effect in terms of the side effects that come with that. Yeah.
And going back to your career, when you were, before you kind of got into the triathlons, was there any kind of sporting background, in terms, did you do any running? You said you didn't do any cycling, but were there any other sports that you were interested in, or was it straight cold turkey into triathlon?
So I was a horse rider when I was young. I was horse obsessed, and then it transitioned into surfing for a little while when Blue Crush was released. And running kind of came into the equation when I was in grade 11 or so. Did the 800 meter at school, and I was like, oh, okay, this is actually quite cool, and I'm not half bad at it. I'm keen to give it a bit more of a whack, and that's kind of where it went from there.
Yeah. And then when was the moment you kind of fell in love with endurance sports or triathlon? Because obviously 800 meters to a triathlon, there's a bit of a gap.
So my dad started running, and my cousin was meant to do 2 oceans with him, but he then got injured and said, well, I've got the entry. Do you just want to do it? This was literally in race week.
Oh, wow.
That was grade 11 for me. So I was 16. And I was like, okay. My dad kind of bribed me and said, I'll run it with you. And I don't know, we'll go get takeout afterwards or whatever it was. So we ran 2 oceans together. It was a struggle fest. I think we did it in like 2.5 hours or something. And he definitely had to drag me up the hills towards the end. And then from there, I realized I really enjoy endurance running. So it was the running that it kind of started with in terms of endurance sport. And then a friend of mine had entered half Ironman, and I thought he was absolutely nuts. And I was a bit curious in terms of wondering if I could do something like that. And that's kind of how it started.
And how was that first one?
It was rough. It was East London, so it's a super tough course.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it. I think it was just, I remember, the swim started and I was like, sure, I'm doing the thing. Like, it was just really cool to do something that a couple of months before I thought I would never be able to do. Yeah.
And how was your nutrition in that first?
I can't even remember what I did, but I do remember, having a couple of sessions where I did definitely blow up. So I definitely did not know as much about it as I do now. And I would probably cringe if I looked back properly and remembered what I did or didn't do back then. Yeah.
Let's get into some of the myths. So myth number 1, caffeine and energy drinks particularly dehydrate you. So obviously a lot of people see caffeine kind of, like dehydrating, or like something like a Red Bull or something as a dehydrator, and they're like, you don't want to be more dehydrated in exercise. So is that true? What is the thinking around hydration and caffeine?
Yeah. So caffeine does have a diuretic effect, which means it increases your urine output by a small percentage, but it's definitely been thrown out of proportion. So it's been found that, even though it has a slight diuretic effect, it's not enough to actually be said that it dehydrates you. And the net liquid intake that you get from, drinking the caffeinated drink is still bigger than that diuretic effect. Yeah. So long story short, that myth is, not true. And it's not something one needs to overly worry about. Obviously, everything should be enjoyed in moderation. But having said that, the net volume in terms of liquid intake still ends up being a point of hydration rather than dehydrating you.
Yeah, and I suppose if your hydration is on point and on, if you focus on it and you do the right things there, it obviously won't have an effect. I think it's probably also a case of people underhydrating and then blaming it on the caffeine.
Yeah, 100%. And caffeine is also something, especially in the context of performance, it's something that's quite specific, and you actually want to have a strategy in terms of how you use it, in terms of how many milligrams per hour are you looking at utilizing during your race. Do you start using it from the get-go or only towards the end? And also everyone tolerates it so differently. You get some people who, for example, can go to bed after having a double espresso, but then you get some who are very sensitive to it. So it's also not a matter of, one size fits all.
I think also a big one, especially when you're starting out, is that you don't need a fuel. I suppose it goes into the fasted thing, but you don't need a fuel on like a short run or a short training session. And I guess when you're kind of starting out, you're like, everything's short, so I don't actually need to even worry about nutrition.
That's a bit of a tricky one as well, because you also need to look at, okay, what was done before the session. If you haven't eaten anything before the session, then you should definitely look at having something during the session, even if it is a shorter one. And also looking at things like the intensity of the session. If it's, just an easy recovery run, then sure, you're not as dependent on, intra-session fuel, versus if it's a high-intensity speed session, for example, where, some fuel could definitely be of benefit.
Yeah. So it's more about intensity than it is about time, actually.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's about both.
Yeah.
And just looking at, what did I do before the run? If you wake up and obviously you didn't eat anything throughout the night, and then you go and do even just a recovery run without having eaten anything, then that's also a slippery slope. So we always want to make sure that you going into your sessions having had something to eat.
Yeah. I think that's so important, because people often are like, my fueling or my nutrition starts when I start my run, and they don't consider the kind of you have, as you say, like, especially in the mornings when you don't eat through the night, and then you kind of have like, minimal stuff in the morning, and then you go train. I think that's also like something to obviously be so cognizant of.
Yeah, and it's also, with the time-starved athlete, the morning sessions are usually very early, and it's also like a food tolerance thing in terms of a lot of people don't feel like eating early in the morning or struggle to eat. So it's just about finding, what works for each individual around that.
Yeah. Next is also quite a kind of tricky one as well, the role of sugar and carbs. So I think especially when it comes to diet, there's obviously a bit of a contradiction where it's like, I want to lose weight, but I need sugar, and, sugar is bad for me, but it's good for me. And it's obviously a bit confusing. So, is sugar kind of a bad thing in terms of exercise and running?
No. So what I always like to bring it back to is we want to think about the context. What context are we speaking about? In the context of performance, we're obviously looking to fuel our body adequately, and that means providing our body with easily accessible carbohydrates. And all carbohydrates get broken down into glucose at the end of the day, but in terms of more refined carbs versus more unrefined carbs, so say your gels, your jelly, your sports nutrition products versus something like, more wholesome carbs, it's obviously a matter of how easily your body can access those carbohydrates. So in the context of performance, we want to look at more easier digestible carbs. But then once you've done your training and you've fueled adequately for that, then you want to look at, okay, let's, look at wholesome fueling, where we're getting our fiber from, our, lean proteins, fruit and veg, all of those things. So I always like to say, try and cushion your nutrition around your training, specifically in the context of, more refined carbohydrates. And there's definitely a place for them, especially when training volume goes up. It's really hard to meet carb requirements with just, whole grain, unrefined carb sources. So that's where those more refined carbohydrate options definitely have a time and place. Also with regards to, just gut comfort and tolerability and that sort, tolerance and that sort of thing.
Going into that kind of, I guess, the pre and the post, and I mean, I suppose even like your during the day eating in terms of carbs, to make sure that you're properly fueled for a session like that, how would you kind of balance that?
So I generally say try and always have something to eat before your training sessions. And again, the context we think we're in now is easily digestible carbohydrates. So whether that be, some peanut butter on toast with a banana or oats or whatever. And then depending on duration and intensity of the session, looking at intra-session fueling. After the session, you want to be getting in a good source of carbs and protein. And then once you've kind of nailed that, then you can look at, okay, now we're focusing on well-balanced meals in terms of, nutrient density, more fiber content and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And does time of the day of exercise matter, in terms of how you're fueling?
Yeah, it would in terms of, how you want to distribute and, dial in your nutrition and juggle it around. So someone who, exercises at 6 a.m., that would probably look a bit different in terms of fueling versus someone who goes out at 11 because they would have breakfast at different times and that sort of thing, yeah.
So then going back to your career, when did it kind of move from, okay, cool, you enjoy triathlon, but then when did it kind of be like, okay, I want to do this professionally? And then how did that journey happen?
It was half Ironman World Champs in PE in 2018. And I placed second there. Sure. And then you kind of start to look at what are the professional times across the races. Would I even be able to compete? What are the girls, doing in terms of times? And then we kind of started to see, okay, there is potential to get there. And, at the smaller races especially, we would definitely be competitive. Maybe not at the big ones just yet. But that's kind of how it then started. And, you kind of get to a bit of a dead end in terms of age group racing. Once you're the top age grouper, you kind of want a new challenge, and it gets a bit boring if you're just kind of, winning the races, especially locally. So it was a matter of kind of, stepping up to the challenge and, jumping into the deep end, very much so. And that's kind of, we just made the call to, go for it and see how we go.
Yeah. What was your kind of first professional race?
We did half Ironman in Japan. Okay. Yeah, that was super cool.
How was that?
Adventurous. Yeah. It was pouring with rain on race day. I ironically lost all of my nutrition on the bike because the roads were waterlogged, so you couldn't really see the bumps, and couldn't see where I was going or anything. So the nutrition fell off, and I didn't even notice. But it was a really cool experience. I ended up coming second, which was a nice surprise. Just the culture and being able to travel and see a different country was very awesome.
And how did your nutrition kind of evolve, during that time?
So in the race specifically?
No, in, going from amateur to professional.
So I like to think that, it didn't change too much in terms of, being intentional about, okay, small frequent feeds, getting in carb requirements, hydration, all of those things. The one thing I probably started to play around with more was increasing carb intake. So trying to aim to get in more on the bike and seeing how that goes, if I tolerate it, if it makes a difference at all, and that sort of thing.
Going back to nutrition for beginners, as I was saying, I think a lot of beginners are like, I want to just start running and worry about nutrition later. What are the
you're like, yes, but, like, what are the 3 things or few things that you tell people, like, immediately? Understand that you're still getting into it, but these are kind of the non-negotiables.
Yeah. The first one would be don't, or try to avoid to do sessions without having eaten anything beforehand. And don't forget about hydration during runs. Even if it's an easy run or if you think you're slow, you still need to fuel. And then carb intake is obviously another big one. And I think a lot of people think that only because they're not going for the win or because they're not competitive, they don't need to focus on nutrition as much. But I guess at the end of the day, we're all there to get the most out of ourselves and be our best. And also you feel so much better when you're fueled. And it's also a matter of adapting to training. So if you're not fueling your body for the work that it's doing, you won't adapt to your training load as well as you would if you had been fueling.
Yeah. I think also a big question is the kind of whole foods versus sports nutrition. And especially when you're starting, you can kind of get away with a bit more with the whole foods, because you're only maybe taking 1 banana. And in terms of kind of training your gut, like you want to obviously get to a point, where you're doing like 5-6 hours and then bananas are not going to be, like you can't have whatever, like 15 bananas, So how do you kind of balance that and have that kind of discussion?
So I always say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And people's fueling looks so different. Some people enjoy the bananas or the baby potatoes or the date balls, whereas others like to just stick with the gels. And it's always a question of, one, cost, because sports nutrition products are very expensive. Tolerance. Some people struggle with baby potatoes, whether it be in terms of chewing or just gut discomfort. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration, and also things like taste. You actually want to, kind of enjoy what you're fueling yourself with. So we want to look at all of those factors when kind of deciding on what works for each athlete. And then once okay, these products work well, then you dial in quantities and that sort of thing.
And a product like Red Bull, would you kind of use that as a supplement energy product, or is it kind of part of your nutrition plan as well?
Both. So it would be, it contains carbohydrates, which is really great. So that would definitely contribute to your carb intake, and then your caffeine within the Red Bull would also contribute to, getting that extra kick whenever you might need it.
Yeah. Going back to the kind of discussion around caffeine, I think it's obviously got a bit of a mixed kind of reaction from people, and as you say, some people can tolerate, some people, I think it's also people don't really know about like the different concentrations and things like that. So what role does, and again I think as we had that discussion with like you've got to kind of look at your exercise versus real life, so what is the role of caffeine in sport, and where can a product like a Red Bull or something like that really make a difference in your training or your racing?
Yeah. So a product like Red Bull, because of its caffeine content, can be really useful for like the harder sessions, and obviously then also racing, because caffeine has been found to have a positive effect on rate of perceived exertion. So something that you might perceive to be like a 9 out of 10 without caffeine is likely to be more of call it a 7 out of 10. So you're likely to perceive it to be a bit easier with caffeine consumption. So that's where something like the Red Bull can be really useful, especially when racing, because you're trying to get the most out of yourself, and also training when it's a harder session. Also super useful because you're trying to hit your paces and your numbers, and that's where it has a really, really good place. And I think a lot of people, they're a bit scared in terms of drinking too much of it. But if you look at the caffeine content of a can of Red Bull, I think it's 75 or 80 milligrams of caffeine per can, which is no more than like your standard cup of coffee. And your upper limit of recommended daily caffeine consumption is 400 milligrams. Yeah. So that's a lot of cans of Red Bull. Yeah. And obviously that's the recommendation for, your general day. Yeah. So when you're looking at the context of performance, it's likely that if you, sticking to the recommendations of an effective caffeine fueling strategy, if we can call it that, you are likely to exceed 400 milligrams.
Yeah. In terms of using it as a kind of pre-workout, is that an effective way? And then, I've also heard that maybe it's also a myth that kind of once you start with the caffeine, you kind of have to keep it going. So if you kind of pre-fuel with caffeine, do you have to then have caffeine throughout your training?
It's hard to say because it affects everyone so differently. So some people will experience that. Others will be fine with, tapping off and then starting again. And some prefer to not have any caffeine up until like the last third of the race, especially if they're more sensitive to it in terms of, gut tolerance and that sort of thing. So it really depends on the individual in terms of what they tolerate and what works best for them.
Yeah. And later in the race, is it again coming down to that perceived effort? Obviously tired, so you're perceiving how much effort you can put in, and then it kind of helps with that.
That's where it really helps, for sure.
Going back to your kind of career, what does, a typical training week look like for you in terms of obviously, training, but then also in terms of nutrition?
So the training weeks aren't always the same in terms of, sessions on a day-to-day basis, but it's usually around, if things are going well, then we try to aim for around 18 to 20 hours a week. So it's obviously split up between swim, bike, run and strength training. And in terms of nutrition, I kind of try to stick with the whole cushioning my nutrition around my training, and also, always being mindful of, is my plate balanced? So do I have my carbohydrates? Do I have my color? Do I have my protein? And also making sure that I'm fueling my sessions in terms of, hydration and carb intake. And also, not restricting myself and listening to my body as well. I think that's where a lot of people have also lost touch a little bit in terms of, okay, I'm always craving sweet things, and instead of seeing that as a lack of willpower or anything like that, actually realizing that's my body telling me that I need more fuel. So, honoring that and actually listening to the body. And, sometimes when it's a bigger training block, I do track intake, but I've kind of learned by now, in terms of not intuitive eating, but I kind of know how much is in what. So I know when I'm fueling well and when I need to be taking in more and that sort of thing. But all in all, it's definitely about, eating a lot, but also making sure that I'm getting in the whole grains, the vitamins and the minerals, the fiber and all of those things as well.
And you've obviously had a bit of an interesting last few years. How's your career, kind of evolved, obviously with, taking some time off. And so talk to me a bit about that kind of journey.
In terms of now training as a mom, it's definitely a lot harder to be intentional about fueling because you kind of come home and then you're in full mom mode. So, you really need to be on top of it in terms of prepping what you are going to have after your session, what you are going to be eating. That's definitely something I've struggled with the most because you can't be caught off guard and you want to do what's, convenient, what's quick, what's easy, and you don't want to have to think about it twice. So I find that kind of sitting down once a week and writing down all the meals that we'll be having for the week, snacks, post-training, fuel, and that sort of thing has really helped me because I know it's there. I know what I'm going to do. I don't need to think about it twice. So it's really helped me to fuel well and also, not fall into any sort of unintentional energy deficit.
Yeah. Did you kind of learn anything, while you were kind of away from the sport that's kind of helped you now going back into it?
I think it's just kind of reminded me that, consistency is key. And even, when you feel like whether it be in terms of fitness or also, nutrition or that sort of thing, just making slow, sustainable changes and chipping away at it day by day will eventually get you to your goals. I think a lot of, new moms or moms in general will know what I'm talking about, especially when you've just had a baby. You kind of feel like, oh my word, how will I ever kind of, not get back to where I was, but get to a point where I feel like myself again. So just, reminding yourself that you must just chip away at it step by step, day by day. The time passes anyway. And then eventually you'll get to a place where, you feel like you're in a better space.
Going back to the kind of nutrition, in terms of like hydration and nutrition, what is your take in terms of like splitting them and the importance of, like kind of both of them?
So you obviously get a lot of sports nutrition products that, like your carb drinks, that kind of double up as both your carbohydrate intake as well as hydration in terms of electrolyte content, which is convenient, but it also presents some, not issues, but it gets tricky, especially for those salty sweaters. So individuals who have a very high sodium concentration in their sweat, because they really need to make sure that they're getting in enough sodium as well as, overall fluid intake. And if they are just going for a generic carb drink, it's likely to be a bit difficult for them, because they're likely to be getting in too much carbs and too little sodium, which will likely lead to stomach upsets. So for someone like that, it's probably a better way to go in terms of just keeping hydration in the bladder or in their bottles, and fuel is in your pocket. So, whether it be gels or food or whatever, just so that you can keep a closer eye on your hydration and your sodium intake, because it's so specific and so important for those salty sweaters. And it's obviously tricky to say who is a salty sweater and who isn't. In an ideal world, we would all do a sweat composition test. And if anyone can do that, it's a great thing to do, because then you kind of eliminating the guesswork. But some general signs to look out for are, if you're someone who struggles with cramping, or if you have like salt marks on your skin or on your clothes after exercising, those are generally indicators that you're more likely to be a salty sweater, which means you really want to maybe look into using some of the higher sodium drinks out there on the market.
And what are the kind of signs of sort of, proper hydration or dehydration that people can kind of pick up on?
So I think if you're hydrating adequately, then, you get through a race without being dizzy, or there's no cramping, and you feel fresh. Whereas if someone is dehydrated, things that often come up are, like I said, dizziness, just feeling a bit like, confused. Cramping is a big one. Then nausea, vomiting are also signs of dehydration. So all of those things are something you want to keep an eye out for.
Yeah. Now, in terms of that, I guess pre and post, in terms of hydration, I think it's the same as we were talking about before, where people are like, start my exercise, start hydrating, finish my exercise, finish hydrating type thing. So what is the thinking around before and after in terms of hydration?
Before, it's obviously a bit tricky, especially depending on what time of day you're training. But, a nice thing to kind of keep an eye on is the color of your urine. You want to try and have it be a pale yellow. Early in the morning, that's obviously unlikely, because you've just slept the whole night and not had much to drink. So if you're training early in the morning, a good thing to start off with is, a nice big glass of water, electrolytes if you have. And that's usually, something that will set you up nicely. And then afterwards, you want to make sure that you can keep an eye on the color of your urine and how often you go to the bathroom. But they generally say, trying to meet your weight loss in terms of water intake, but obviously not everyone weighs themselves before and after, so they don't really know. But if you kind of aim to keep an eye on how frequently you go to the bathroom, the color of your urine, and those sort of things, that's generally a good indicator. And most people realize very quickly, okay, I haven't been to the toilet in like 4 hours, I probably need to drink more. Or things like, cotton mouth, that sort of thing, that's obviously also an indicator of, okay, we need to hydrate a bit better. And also, depending on, a winter run, you'll obviously dehydrate a lot less versus, running in summer. So also thinking of that in terms of, okay, was it a hot run? Did I sweat a lot? And using that to also dictate how much you're going to be hydrating after your session.
I guess a big myth is kind of like you can just hydrate with water. Is that like, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, my hydration was great. I drank enough water, but I still cramped.
So especially during exercise, water alone, I try to, encourage athletes to stay away from just water. So always having something in there, whether it's electrolytes, anything that contains some sodium to help you. Again, depends, are you more salty sweater or not? After training, water alone is fine because you do get your electrolytes in your food as well. So 1 teaspoon of plain table salt, for example, has 2,000 milligrams of sodium for reference. And we obviously all salt our foods and that sort of thing. So you can definitely meet electrolyte rehydration requirements after training with what you're eating. But having said that, there's no harm in, throwing in an electrolyte into your 2-liter water bottle that you sip on throughout the day. So it won't do you any harm by any means.
Yeah. And we chatted about kind of like splitting the hydration and the nutrition. And then would you further kind of split it into that kind of energy, category where it's like you wouldn't combine, hydration, nutrition, and your energy. You wouldn't use like a Red Bull as your kind of sole fuel, throughout a kind of race.
It depends. It also depends on the duration of the race. If it's like, an ultra event, then that's probably not going to get you through it. But if it's, a shorter race, then you probably could get away with it. So it really depends on the duration of the event, what you've been training with, what your requirements are, and all of those things. But when it's a longer event, so anything over, I would say, an hour and a half or so, then you would definitely want to look at, a variety of in terms of hydration and also carb intake. And a lot of people, have been underfueling because it's always a matter of, but then how do I carry it? So that's obviously another part of the conversation. You need to look at, getting some running shorts with enough pockets, or the sports bras have pockets these days, or a running belt. Or there's also, what I really like is a lot of people are starting to run with their vests. Yeah. In a marathon, even though there are water tables. But realistically, just going with the water tables alone won't get you what you want to be getting in terms of an optimal hydration and nutrition strategy. And you just want to be ticking all the boxes if you want to get the most out of yourself. So I always say only because you could doesn't mean that you should. So really try and, dot the I's and cross the T's and try and nail it.
Trail running beats up everything, your legs, your lungs, and especially your feet. The last thing you need is socks that give up before you do. That's why I'm thrilled to announce that this season of Trail Chasers is sponsored by Gilnockie Socks. These aren't just your run-of-the-mill socks. Gilnockie socks are made for people who demand more. More performance, more durability, and more comfort. They're designed to prevent blisters with premium moisture-wicking materials that keep your feet dry no matter how long or muddy the trail gets. Plus, they're treated with HydroCool and Silver Plus, so they stay fresh, breathable, and ready for your next adventure. Since I started using Gilnockie socks, I haven't had to stop mid-run to adjust or worry about discomfort. They just keep working mile after mile, run after run. So why settle for socks that don't keep up? Visit gilnockie.com and use the code TRAILCHASERS at checkout for 20% off your first order. Trust me, once you try them, you won't go back. Your feet will thank you. When you're kind of new and you're starting out, as you're kind of mentioning those different factors, what are the things you take into account, as you're saying, like time, intensity, what are the key kind of things you should look out for?
So I think for a beginner, a nice guideline is, one, always have something to eat before your sessions. And if you're not used to eating or not comfortable with it, start small. Start with, if it's a bite of a banana, if it's half a rusk, if it's a handful of jelly babies, yes, they might not fall into the inverted commas health category, but going back to context, we're looking to fuel. So jellies contain easily digestible carbs, so they have a place when it comes to eating before exercise. And then once you're comfortable with that, slowly increase it to an optimal amount in terms of pre-session fuel. And then during your runs, looking at trying to do small frequent feeds. That's generally the easiest way to get in your fuel. So I usually say try to aim for having something to eat every 20 to 30 minutes, whether it's a gel, a handful of jelly babies, a date bar, some baby potatoes, whatever floats your boat. And in terms of hydration, a very general guideline is trying to aim for about 500 mils of liquids per hour. Obviously, with your electrolytes, depending on, how of a salty sweater you are. And obviously, if the conditions are very hot, you'd probably be at the higher end of that. And also, if the conditions are cooler, you'd probably not need as much. So, but that kind of gives you a bit of a rough guideline to fuel well.
And you've touched a bit on the hydration of the signs you can kind of pick up. But how do you, what are the other ways in terms of hydration that you can know? I mean, other than obviously doing like a sweat test, that you can kind of know exactly what you need. And then obviously in terms of nutrition, how does that work in terms of testing, what works for you, but also also increasing your kind of carbs, how do you kind of go about that?
So in terms of the carbs, the general guideline is going with 0.8 to 1 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per hour. So that gives you a guide. So, someone who weighs 60 kilograms would be around 60 grams of carbs per hour. But if you haven't been doing that, and if you're used to taking in 10 grams of carbs per hour, don't go from 10 to 60. Yeah. So, see what you have been doing, see where you are in terms of the recommendations, and then kind of build from there, and then see, okay, my gut's comfortable with this, I feel good, and then you can increase it. And you can even go past it a little bit and play around and see. Some people feel better with a bit more, some don't need as much, but it's a matter of trial and error. And that's also why I always say it's better to start practicing your race day fueling weeks, if not months in advance, before a race versus 2 weeks out, because there's so much you want to trial to really find your sweet spot.
Yeah.
In terms of hydration, it is tricky because you're kind of guessing a little bit. And because we don't know what the sweat concentration is. But you kind of want to, again, you can play around with a couple of things. If you know that you do tend to cramp, you have those salty sweat marks on your clothes and your skin after training, then you can start with, say 800 milligrams of sodium per hour, per liter of liquid sort of thing. And then see how you feel with that. And if you're still struggling, you can increase it a bit. And that way you can kind of find what works best for you.
Going back to kind of a myth, in terms of hydration, when the weather's cold, do you actually need to hydrate, as much as you do in the heat?
Definitely not as much, but we do still want to be getting in some form of hydration, yeah. But definitely not as much as, like a hot, humid race.
Yeah. And then, if you're looking at sort of like an energy product, is there a specific time, or is it very much like a feeling, when you're kind of feeling that dip, or is there, you should have it maybe an hour before an end or something like that? Is it what's the kind of recommendation?
Also a bit of a gray area because, some people it kicks in, it takes a bit longer to kick in versus others. Yeah. A general rule of thumb is, about half an hour before, try and get it in before the start of the race. And like I said, some people don't like to have it until the last third of the race because they know they experience a bit of gut discomfort with it because of the caffeine content. So then they would obviously wait until, the latter part of the race before taking it in. But I think also you want to go into a race kind of knowing what to expect somewhat in terms of how you'll feel. So a lot of people, that's also a big mistake people make, is that they only start fueling or, upping nutrition once they start feeling flat, and it's too late at that point. Yeah. Getting out of that is very hard, if not impossible. So you really want to make sure you're on top of things and that, the energy drinks, etc., are simply kind of supplementing your basic nutrition strategy to help you get the most out of yourself.
When someone's starting out or coming to you for the first time, how important is that kind of, I guess, history in terms of what they're currently doing just in the day-to-day life, or what they have been doing in their, if someone's coming from a place of having done no exercise or very limited exercise, how important is that history in terms of what they have done, in terms of the caffeine, in terms of, eating and foods and things like that?
Yeah, very important, because obviously it tells me, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them. I ask a bunch of questions about, do you struggle with cramping, all of those things, to see, okay, is this maybe a more salty sweater or not? What products have you used, what's worked, what hasn't? And that then gives me a good picture in terms of, okay, where do we start and how do we build from here, in terms of starting points of hourly carb intake, hydration strategy, and that sort of thing. And then you kind of always touch base after the key sessions and say, okay, how are you feeling? What worked? What didn't work? And then you reassess and adjust, going from there to find the sweet spot.
And in terms of, I think we did touch on it, but there's so many products and, obviously so many foods that can give you the different things. And obviously important to test your nutrition. Where do you even you start, in terms of if you walk into like a discount or something like that, there's just a million different products, and even with energy drinks and things like that. So where's the kind of the starting point?
Super tricky, because you're right, it's so overwhelming. What I generally do is, if they're completely new and they have no idea what to go with, I kind of try and gauge what they have enjoyed in the past, because you can kind of see if it's someone who prefers the sports nutrition products or someone who wants to stay with more whole food options. But I usually, say, take a walk through Discam, keep an eye out for some of these brands and look at the flavors, see what appeals to you, buy a couple of sample sizes and see what tastes good, what you enjoy. And then we see what works for you and what you like. And then you can commit to the big tub.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And does price factor in? Obviously, in terms of personally, you want to buy cheaper stuff, but I'm saying in terms of the most expensive things are the better things, or is that also a bit of a...
No, not necessarily. Yeah, you definitely have some, more better priced products out on the market that still will, give you the same benefit as something that's, very well marketed and very expensive.
And what are the key things you're looking for, in terms of walking into a Discam, you're picking up a product, obviously, if it's a carb product or if it's, so what are the key kind of things you're looking for in terms of that product? I guess what it says on the label versus what's in it.
So, with a carb drink, for example, you want to, and most of these adhere to these, this criteria, if I can put it that way, but you want a variety of carb sources, because when it comes to carbohydrates, your gut has different transport channels by which the carbohydrates get absorbed into your bloodstream. So if you're only taking in one source of carbs, say it's only fructose, then that channel's going to get overloaded, but the sucrose or glucose channel will be completely open. So that's why you want a variety of carb sources.
And that would be in one product.
There's usually a split in those products. So that would be the one thing. But like I said, most of them do contain a variety. And if you're someone who's a salty sweater, then obviously your sodium concentration is something you want to take a look at. And that's where they vary quite a bit. Most carb drinks contain about 40 grams of carbs per serving, but they vary quite a bit in sodium per serving. So like I said, if you are more salty sweater, then you want to check that out, or even just go for a plain electrolyte that only contains your electrolytes and no carbs, to just have your hydration in your bottles, and then you get your fueling in with something like gels or jelly sweets. And those are generally, same story in terms of carbs. You want to see what's in them in terms of a variety and making sure that it's giving you what you need to perform.
We've talked about kind of the splitting between the carb and the hydration, but with something like sodium, would you look to kind of build it up over an hour, in a variety of products? Or would you kind of one shot sorted my sodium and then, that's kind of at least taken care of?
I prefer to kind of split it up a bit versus, just doing one shot, because obviously you're not sweating all at once. It's like a gradual progression sort of thing. And that also makes sure that you're not overloading your system with too much sodium at once. So you kind of, sip feeding it, if that makes sense.
Is there a limit on, can you take too much sodium?
Yeah, you definitely can. And the tricky thing is that presents itself sometimes similar to dehydration. So that's where one also needs to be careful. But, too much sodium, so it's called hyponatremia, is generally or presents itself with, swollen fingers or, being very puffy. So if that's something that you find happens to you, then you might be taking in too much. So there definitely is an upper limit.
Yeah. When it comes to recovery, I think it's obviously also quite a difficult area because often you finish your exercise and you're like, cool, I'm done, box ticked. What are the important things there that you need to make sure you're doing? And especially, I think, the thing I've often struggled with, and I suppose a lot of beginners will kind of struggle with, is if you're doing a race or something like that, how do you kind of balance that and those kind of considerations?
It's tricky. And I'll always say this to my clients as well is, fueling adequately requires a certain amount of effort and being intentional, and it's not easy because you really do need to be on top of things and plan ahead and make sure you sort it because you do often get caught off guard, and it's also a matter of finishing a session and then you're really tired, you don't feel like prepping food or whatever, and just prepping beforehand to have something on hand so that you don't fall into that scenario where you then end up not taking in anything. But generally what you want to be doing after, a harder session or a race is get in a good source of carbs as well as protein. I often see athletes only taking in, their whey protein, which leaves a lot on the table because you do want to replenish your glycogen stores first and foremost in combination with your protein. And you want to be getting in around 60 to 80 grams of carbs and about 20 grams of protein. And, if you're out and about and you haven't packed your recovery shake or your chosen recovery meal, you can totally go to, the nearest petrol station, which is usually somewhat nearby, and grab a couple of chocolate milks or something like that, and get your recovery in like that. That is also a great alternative. So there's definitely ways to get around a lack of preparation, if I can put it that way.
In terms of like energy products, do those play any role in kind of recovery, like your Red Bulls and things like that, or would that just be a pre and during?
Yeah, so I would generally recommend those for more pre and during races and performance, because after, a harder session or harder race, we want our bodies to recover, and our bodies recover when they're in a rest and digest state. So when our nervous system is calm, heart rate lowers, that's when our body starts to recover and make those training adaptations. So if you then, having a lot of caffeine and stimulants, your body will still be in a state of fight or flight, which can affect your recovery, definitely.
And alcohol?
Also not the best, but if it's been a big race and you've got your time and your finishers medal, then I'm also not one to say no to a post-race beer.
Yeah.
Everything in moderation, but if you're trying to take your training seriously, and if it's just a training run, then I would say try and limit it. One beer won't push you over the edge or take away too many gains. But at the same time, you can also maybe go for a 0% alcohol beer if you wanna be serious. But yeah, alcohol is definitely not the best when it comes to recovery.
Yeah. And whole foods versus chocolate milks or nutritional supplements, things like that. If you've got access to both, is there a better way, or is it just however you can get it?
Getting it in is the priority. So a lot of people struggle to eat, a whole food meal after a harder session, understandably so. So just drinking your recovery meal is generally just the easiest thing to do. And then once you've got that in and your blood's back in your gut after the race, then you can go and look at having, a more wholesome meal. So I generally say, whatever you feel like. The main thing is that you get it in.
And is there a window that, that it becomes less effective in?
So you want to get it in as soon as possible. Generally, around an hour and a half, within an hour and a half to 2 hours max. I usually say try within the hour to really get the most out of it.
Going back to your career, how much of your training and adaptation, has been on the mental side, and how tough has that kind of been to get right?
Yeah, quite a bit. And I have worked with, sports psychologists from time to time, because it does definitely play a huge part in terms of, preparing yourself adequately and, backing yourself. And I think we all have, little demons that like to whisper in our ears and that sort of thing. So, the sports psychology behind it is definitely huge. And just working on, channeling those nerves the way to help us to reach our best potential, I guess.
And does nutrition play a role in that, kind of keeping you, I guess, mentally focused and not, I guess when your nutrition's low, you probably, your mental fatigue starts setting in.
Yeah, for sure. And I always say, one sign of underfueling is if you find yourself being grumpy all the time.
I just thought that was just me all the time, yeah.
Usually our significant others pick up on this one before we do. So nutrition definitely plays a part in terms of making sure that you're happy. Also, we all, emotional eaters to a point. Food's there to be enjoyed. It definitely, brings with it, happy feelings. There's nothing like a good, donut or whatever it might be. So just, making sure that you have that balance and that, you still including all foods is super important. And it's also something, we sit around a dinner table and have good conversations and build connections around. So, having that a part of it is also, super important for a balanced and, well-performing athlete.
And how do you kind of break these myths and these stigmas, around certain foods, certain food groups, especially if someone comes to you starting out a bit later in life and, they've built up a whole kind of lifetime of being told what's good and what's bad?
It's tricky, but generally, you break it down in a rational way and explain it to them, also from a scientific point of view. And most of the time they are receptive to it, but obviously it is difficult if it comes from a, lifetime of being, shamed in terms of food and being told carbs are bad, you're going to gain weight. Then it does take more time to work with those clients, and it is something where you need to be in communication with them more regularly and also kind of hold their hand in the journey of teaching them how to fuel themselves adequately. But generally, once they then start to implement the recommended changes and see the benefit of it, they're completely different people and athletes, because they see, oh my gosh, I feel so much better, I'm getting stronger, I'm getting faster. So then they believe what you've told them, which is really great.
And how important is that kind of education in that process?
Huge. Yeah. I mean, that kind of, that's a starting point in terms of getting them on board and getting them to try what you're suggesting versus just saying to them, no, you have to eat your peanut butter sandwich before you go and train. Whereas if you explain to them, the theory behind it all, then they're more likely to be receptive of that.
Yeah. Going back to your kind of journey, if you had to go back, what would you kind of tell yourself in terms of nutrition, when you kind of first did that Ironman in the beginning?
Probably you need to fuel a bit more. Because I don't think I fueled enough, no. Yeah. Not intentionally, I just didn't know any better. Yeah.
And what is the most rewarding part of your job that like keeps you coming back week after week and, helping people?
I think it's definitely when it clicks and when they come to me and they're like, oh my gosh, I've never felt so strong on a long ride or long run. I'm recovering better. I'm getting stronger. I'm getting faster. And you can just see the change in the athlete. I think I love getting those messages where they tell me that they feel so much better. They don't have cravings all the time. Their mood swings have improved, and they've got a better relationship with food. That definitely, makes me love what I do.
Do you get to a point then where it's like what works, and we don't like tinker with anything else? Or do you kind of still, maybe look at other things?
Most of the time you kind of get to a point where they found their sweet spot, but then sometimes you do a follow-up to see if there's any areas where we can maybe, improve a bit, whether it be in terms of recovery or pre-session fueling or that sort of thing as well. Yeah.
And I guess something with like an Ironman, we've got like 3 different sports. How important is to have a multi, I guess, nutrition, hydration strategy, or is it kind of or just one product that you can sort of see yourself through, or 3?
It kind of depends. So it depends on, how long is the athlete going to be out there. Your competitive athletes who are out there for a lot shorter might be or are more likely to get away with, just using a small amount of products, where someone who's out there for, the full 16 hours is likely to benefit from having a bit more in their toolbox in terms of variety, just because you do get sweet fatigue, on the palate and that sort of thing. And that's also something you want to practice in your training to see, okay, what works, what do I feel like? And obviously with an event like Ironman, you also have the logistics of the special needs bags. So, figuring out what are we going to put into those. So yeah, it is quite a process to find the perfect nutrition strategy. But yeah, it differs from, faster athlete to a bit slower.
And would you say the bike is kind of the place where you would, do like your majority of your kind of nutrition just because of the ease of access?
Yeah, definitely. And also because it's not as mechanically jarring as running, your gut can generally tolerate more. And you really want to make sure that you're getting in enough on the bike so that you set yourself up for a strong marathon, because, running a marathon on its own is brutal, but off the back end of a 3.8K swim and a 180K bike, you don't want to be, skating on thin ice, and you want to make sure that you get onto that run having fueled your bike well so that you can, set yourself up for a strong run.
Yeah. And how important is it that you use yourself as a guinea pig testing kind of subject?
It is important, and I must say I was quite nervous before my first full in terms of nutrition, because I'd heard of so many mishaps in a full Ironman, and I was like, I can't get this wrong because it's going to look so bad if my nutrition fails. But at the same time, what works for me won't work for everyone. So again, it varies from person to person, but it's always good to have that personal experience to know what you're dealing with, because, real life is very different to, just the scientific research on its own.
What are the biggest mistakes that you've kind of made over your career in terms of nutrition?
Probably when I started, just not taking in enough. I probably underestimated that. But obviously what was nice is as I got into the sport, I started studying it. So I quickly figured out, okay, no, we need to change this, we need to change that. And then, I got onto it reasonably quickly, which helped me to figure it out as well.
Coming back to the sock question to close, what are the 2 words that you would have on your on your socks?
I think I would choose, I'll be cheesy, probably keep going.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Especially for an Ironman. That's pretty important.
Just keep one foot in front of the other and you'll get there eventually.
Amazing. Yeah. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And good luck with the training for the year, and good luck with the World Champs.
Thank you.